won't believe what happened when a hard-working family man had his life completely destroyed by a mistake that would not only change his fate, but also reveal deep flaws in our justice system. What began as an ordinary day turned into the greatest injustice you've ever heard of, and the ending of this story will leave you speechless. Imagine for a moment that you're living a normal, peaceful life, with no major worries other than the monthly bills and your children's future. You wake up early, drink your coffee, kiss your wife on the forehead, and go to work. This is exactly how every day began for Roberto, a 38-year-old mechanic who had built a simple but dignified life with his own hands, calloused by a lifetime of honest work. Roberto lived in a modest house in the suburbs with his wife Maria and their two children, 12-year-old Ana and 8-year-old Pedro. It was one of those houses you pass on the street and feel the warmth of a true home. A small but well-tended garden by Maria herself, the children's bicycles in the garage, a wooden table on the porch where the family gathered every Sunday for lunch after Mass. He was the kind of man everyone in the neighborhood admired, always willing to help when needed, fixing the children's bikes for free, lending tools to neighbors without hesitation, and never failing to greet everyone with a sincere smile that came from the heart. His auto repair shop was small, perhaps only 50 square meters, but it had a soul you could feel the moment you walked in. The walls were decorated with old calendars of classic cars, tools organized with the precision of someone who respected their work, and a framed painting with the first 100 real bill he'd ever earned when he opened the business 15 years ago. He had a loyal clientele who trusted his honest work and always fair prices. Donna Rosa always brought her light blue VW Beetle there, Mr. Jose trusted only Roberto to fix his work truck, and even people from distant neighborhoods came because they knew he wouldn't invent defects that didn't exist just to make more money. Roberto had a routine he followed religiously, like a sacred ritual that gave meaning to his days. He always woke at 5:30 in the morning, even before his alarm clock rang, made strong coffee in the small but cozy kitchen he had renovated himself, read a few pages of a mechanic's book, always studying, always striving to improve and offer an ever better service to his clients, and kissed Maria on the forehead before she left for her morning shift at the local hospital where she had worked as a nurse for almost 10 years. On that Tuesday morning that would change his life forever, Roberto followed his usual routine, never imagining it would be the last time he would make that journey as a free man. He got up at 5:30 sharp, made coffee while Maria was still sound asleep after a long 16-hour shift at the hospital, and walked to his workshop, just 10 blocks from home. It was a route he had taken for over 15 years. He knew every corner, every tree, every pothole in the poorly maintained asphalt. He religiously greeted the same shopkeepers who opened their doors at the same time as him, Mr. Antonio from the bar, Miss Vera from the pharmacy, Carlos from the newspaper, and stopped at the same bar for the same strong coffee, always accompanied by 2 slices of toast with butter and a smile to start the day right. The neighborhood where Roberto lived and worked was one of those places that still exist in the heart of rural towns, where everyone knows each other by name, where children play in the street safely, where doors remain open during the day, because trust is still worth more than any lock. It was a community united by decades of coexistence, where one person's problems became everyone's problems, where joys were shared on the sidewalks and sorrows shared to make them lighter to bear. At 7:30 sharp, like every day for the past 15 years, Roberto opened the workshop doors with that good feeling of another day of work ahead. The familiar smell of oil and grease, the organized mess of tools he knew inside and out, the comforting sound of cars passing by on the street, all of this was part of a world he completely mastered, where he felt useful and respected. The first customer of the day was already waiting, leaning against his car, João, a 67-year-old retiree, always punctual, always polite, with a radiator problem in his white Chevette, which was already over 20 years old, but which he treated with the affection reserved for family members. "Roberto, my son," said João with that affectionate way of someone who already considered the mechanic almost like a son. "This radiator is giving me trouble again. It must be the upper hose, right? You know how it is, these old parts." Roberto smiled with the patience he always showed with older customers, especially João, who he knew depended on that car not only as a means of transportation, but as a symbol of independence and dignity in old age. Roberto began his work as he did every day, with the meticulous attention to detail and dedication that kept his clients coming back and recommending his services to friends and family. He played his usual music on the small radio that sat on a makeshift shelf, a local station that played traditional country music mixed with local and regional news. It was a simple but vibrant environment, where work was done with genuine love and total dedication. Around 10 in the morning, while Roberto's hands were covered in grease, completely focused on solving the complex problem with João's radiator, making those small, delicate adjustments that only years of experience can teach a man, 2 police cars pulled up in front of his shop, their brakes screeching like a sharp blade through the morning air. The sudden, unexpected sirens brought a few curious onlookers to the sidewalk. Mrs. Maria from the bakery on the corner, young Carlos from the pharmacy across the street, and some children playing ball on the sidewalk in front. Roberto slowly raised his head, with the natural curiosity of someone with absolutely nothing to fear, wiped his hands on the old worn cloth he always carried in his shirt pocket, and walked to the workshop door, imagining that perhaps it was just a routine checkpoint, or perhaps some nearby accident that required the attention of the authorities. It hadn't even crossed his mind that those officers were there because of him. But when he saw 4 police officers getting out of their cars, all of them with expressions far too serious for a Tuesday morning, impeccably pressed uniforms, and the calculated movements of those with a specific mission to accomplish, Roberto felt a strange chill creep up his spine. There was something about their posture, the way they looked directly at him, that made his heart start to beat a little faster than usual. One of the officers, a tall, thin man with a neatly trimmed grey mustache and piercing eyes that seemed to see right through you, approached with a determined, sure step. When he was close enough to Roberto that he could smell the coffee on the officer's breath, he asked in a firm, official voice, "Are you Roberto Silva, the owner of this garage?" When Roberto nodded, still trying to understand what was happening, still naively hoping it was some simple misunderstanding that would be resolved in a few minutes with a civilized conversation, the police officer said the words that would echo in his tormented mind for the next 25 years. Words that would divide his life forever into a before and an after. "Roberto Silva, you are under arrest for aggravated homicide. You have the right to remain silent and to have a lawyer present during the interrogation." Roberto felt as if the ground had literally disappeared beneath his feet, as if all reality he knew had dissolved in that exact moment like sugar in water. Murder. He had never hurt a fly in his life, never even been involved in a heated argument at the bar, let alone anything that could result in someone's death. His words came out hurriedly, desperately, filled with a genuine confusion that anyone with a shred of sensitivity could sense. "There must be some terrible mistake. You're confusing people. I've never killed anyone in my life." But the handcuffs were already being placed on his wrists, the cold metal squeezing his skin like a cruel vice that would forever mark the end of his life as a free man. The neighbors and customers nearby watched in utter shock, whispering to each other in disbelieving voices, pointing discreetly, trying to process what their eyes were seeing, but their minds refused to accept. João, who was still patiently waiting for his car to be ready, stared at the scene with his mouth open, unable to believe that this man he'd known for years, whom he trusted completely, could be arrested for something so terrible. "There must be some mistake," shouted Donna Maria from the bakery, her voice piercing the air like a cry of protest against injustice. "Roberto is a good person. He's never hurt an ant. You're arresting the wrong man." But the police continued their work with the professional and mechanical coldness of those who had already witnessed hundreds of arrests and knew that appearances can be deceiving, that even the dearest neighbors can hide terrible secrets behind false smiles and calculated kindness. As he was led to the police car, under the stunned gaze of the entire neighborhood gathered on the sidewalk, Roberto could only think of his family, of the life he had built brick by brick over so many years of honest labor. How would he explain this absurd situation to Maria when she arrived home from work to find the workshop closed and the neighbors whispering about the arrest? How would his innocent children react upon learning their father had been arrested? What would Anna's schoolmates say when the news spread? How would 8-year-old Pedro, with his blind trust in his father, understand something that even Roberto couldn't grasp? At the police station, an old, poorly maintained building with peeling walls that looked like they had seen decades of human suffering, and a persistent, musty smell that seemed to absorb all hope from anyone who entered, Roberto finally learned the specific details of the accusation that left him even more terrified and confused. He was being accused of the brutal and cowardly murder of a young woman named Carla Regina Santos, just 28 years old, mother of a small girl, found dead in a vacant lot on the other side of town, in an industrial area Roberto rarely visited and more than 15 kilometers from his home and workshop. The police chief in charge of the case, a middle-aged man with thick glasses, thinning grey hair, and a permanently weary expression of someone who had seen too much of human nature over decades of police work, explained with frightening clinical coldness the specific reasons for the arrest that were destroying Roberto's life at that very moment. The evidence against him seemed like something out of a nightmare. His clear, sharp fingerprints had been found on the victim's brown leather bag. 3 independent witnesses categorically claimed to have seen a man with Roberto's exact physical characteristics near the crime scene at the estimated time of the murder. Furthermore, Roberto couldn't provide a solid, convincing alibi for the critical period in question. He was alone at home in the early hours of the morning, presumably sleeping, while Maria worked her night shift at the hospital, as she had done twice a week for years. Every word that came out of the police chief's mouth landed like a heavy stone in Roberto's stomach, creating a physical sensation of nausea and despair. Fingerprints? How was that even possible? He insisted on swearing on his children's lives that he had never seen that woman in his life, never been to that specific place, never touched that bag or anything belonging to the victim. Roberto tried to explain with all the sincerity and desperation he could muster that there had been a terrible mistake, an absurd confusion that needed to be cleared up immediately before his reputation and his life were completely destroyed. His words came out in a rush, charged with genuine emotion that any sensitive person could detect. But the police chief merely shook his head with that skeptical, weary expression of someone who had heard thousands of similar versions throughout his career. "Mr. Roberto," the police chief said in a monotonous, disbelieving voice, "I've been in this profession for over 20 years. Every accused person who's come before me has said exactly the same thing you're saying now. They all claim they're innocent, that it was all a misunderstanding, that there's some explanation. But the physical evidence doesn't lie, and in this case it speaks louder than any protestation of innocence." Roberto felt as if he was screaming desperately into a deep, dark well, his words echoing in the void without finding any ears truly willing to listen to his version of the facts with an open mind. When Maria arrived at the police station 3 hours later, after being informed of her husband's arrest by a neighbor who had witnessed the entire scene and rushed frantically to the hospital to break the news, her expression of absolute panic and utter confusion shattered Roberto's heart into 1,000 tiny pieces. She had rushed out of the hospital in the middle of her shift, still wearing her white nurse's uniform, stained from the morning's shift, her hair disheveled from the desperate dash across the city to reach the police station. Maria had known Roberto intimately for over 20 years, since they were just two shy teenagers who met at a distant relative's wedding. She knew better than anyone else that he was absolutely incapable of harming any living being, that he cried when he saw injured animals abandoned on the street, that he had a heart too kind for this cruel and competitive world. But when the police chief coldly presented her with all the evidence that had been gathered against her husband, Maria felt as if the ground was shifting beneath her feet. The evidence the police chief methodically explained to her was truly frightening and compelling in a way that defied any logical explanation. Roberto's fingerprints were clearly marked on the victim's purse. 3 completely independent witnesses, people who didn't even know each other, had identified Roberto as the man they saw at the scene of the crime. Security cameras from nearby businesses showed a figure who bore a striking physical resemblance to her husband. "How did your fingerprints get on her bag, Roberto?" Maria asked, her voice cracking, tears streaming freely down her face as she clutched the cold bars of the cell where Roberto waited like a caged animal. Her voice was filled with a pain that went far beyond simple confusion. It was the deep pain of watching the world she knew and loved crumble like a house of cards in a storm. Roberto looked directly into the eyes of the woman he had loved for over 2 decades, the mother of his children, his companion through thick and thin, his best friend and confidant. And for the first time in his life, he saw something he had never seen before, something that frightened him more than any accusation, a tiny, poisonous seed of doubt planted deep within her gaze. It was just a flicker, a barely perceptible hesitation, but Roberto saw it clearly and knew in that moment that seed would grow until it destroyed everything they had built together over so many years. News of Roberto's arrest spread through the community with the devastating speed of a fire in dry weather. Within hours, the entire neighborhood, all the local businesses, all the shop's customers, in short, the entire small town, knew that Roberto Silva, the beloved and respected mechanic, the man who for 15 years had been considered a perfect example of honesty and hard work, was being accused of a horrific and unbelievable crime. The phones rang non-stop for days, the conversations at the gates multiplied exponentially, and a heavy, suffocating atmosphere of disbelief, mixed with suspicion, hung over the entire neighborhood like a dark storm cloud that refused to lift. It was as if the entire natural order of things had been violently disrupted. The neighbors were deeply divided into 2 distinct groups. On one side were those who simply couldn't believe what was happening. "It's impossible. Roberto wouldn't do this in a million years. This must all be a terrible mistake by the police." On the other side, those who began to suspect and question whether they had actually known Roberto began to appear. "You never really know what goes on in people's heads, do you? Sometimes the ones who seem the most saintly are the ones who have the worst secrets." Me. In the weeks following the arrest, more evidence continued to mount against Roberto, like cursed pieces of a sinister puzzle that seemed to fit together with a frightening and inexplicable perfection. Security cameras from a convenience store just 2 blocks from the crime scene clearly showed a man who, according to detailed analysis by forensic experts, bore a striking physical resemblance to Roberto, walking through the area at precisely the time the forensic experts estimated the murder to have occurred. A strand of hair found stuck to the victim's clothing was analyzed in specialized laboratories and showed microscopic characteristics strikingly similar to Roberto's hair. Tiny fragments of fabric that appeared to have been torn out during a violent struggle were collected from under the victim's fingernails and, when analyzed, yielded fibers completely consistent with the type of work shirt Roberto regularly wore in the workshop. Each new piece of evidence that surfaced was like a cruel and precise stab in the chest of a man who knew with absolute certainty that he was innocent, but who could find no plausible explanation for the impossible accumulation of evidence against him. How could so much physical evidence point to him if he had never been to that place, never seen that woman, never participated in any crime? The defense attorney appointed by the state to represent Roberto for free was a young, recent law school graduate named Dr. Fernando Oliveira. With only 2 years of practical courtroom experience and an absolutely crushing workload that simultaneously included dozens of other complex criminal cases. During their first conversations in the small, claustrophobic room reserved for attorney-client meetings, a windowless room with only an old table and 2 cheap plastic chairs, Roberto realized with growing horror that not even his own attorney was completely convinced of his innocence. "Look, Roberto, Doctor," Fernando said during one of his first visits to the jail, nervously adjusting his glasses and shuffling his court papers uncomfortably without being able to look his client directly in the eye. "I need to be completely honest with you. The evidence against you is really very strong, very consistent, very convincing. The prosecutor has a practically closed case on his hands." The young lawyer paused for a long, ponderous moment before continuing. "Perhaps it would be much better for you if we seriously considered the possibility of reaching a plea bargain with the prosecutor. We could plead a crime of passion or self-defense or even temporary mental disorder. Any of these alternatives could significantly reduce your final sentence." Roberto categorically refused this suggestion, his voice louder than intended in the small room and echoing off the bare walls. "I didn't kill anyone. I'm not going to confess to something I didn't do just to get a lesser sentence. I'm completely innocent of this crime." But with each day he spent in pre-trial detention, anxiously awaiting the trial that would decide his fate, Roberto saw his entire life crumbling like a house of cards in a relentless gale. Maria began visiting him less and less frequently, and when she did, their conversations were tense, awkward, filled with heavy silences and looks of mutual incomprehension. The children, Ana and Pedro, asked innocent and painful questions that Maria didn't know how to answer without completely destroying their image of their father. Roberto's trial became the most talked about and anticipated judicial event in the small town in decades. The courthouse, an imposing building with classical architecture that normally handled only routine traffic cases and minor family disputes, was completely packed during every day of the hearings, with people forming long lines from the early hours of the morning to get a seat in the crowded and cramped galleries. It was as if the entire community wanted to witness firsthand the dramatic and public downfall of a man who had been respected and admired by all for so many years. The local press, which normally limited itself to covering school events, city council meetings, and holiday festivals, suddenly discovered an unexpected and lucrative source of news. Reporters from neighboring towns descended like vultures. Television cameras were strategically placed throughout the courthouse, and Roberto found himself at the center of a veritable media circus that alternately portrayed him as a monster masquerading as a model citizen or as a possible victim of an unprecedented miscarriage of justice. The public prosecutor in charge of the prosecution was Dr. Enrique Almeida, a 52-year-old man, extremely ambitious and politically astute, known throughout the region for his persuasive and mesmerizing oratory and for an impressive 15-year streak without ever losing a single homicide case. There were persistent rumors that he harbored serious political ambitions for higher office, and he saw this high-profile case as a golden opportunity to demonstrate his professional competence to a much wider audience than usual. Dr. Enrique always dressed impeccably. His posture was naturally imposing and intimidating, and his voice had that magnetic, hypnotic quality that made jurors automatically lean forward to not miss a single word he was saying. He was a natural orator, a skilled manipulator of human emotions. During his dramatic opening presentation to the jury, 12 ordinary people from the local community who regarded Roberto with a disturbing mix of morbid curiosity, anticipatory revulsion, and an almost primal thirst for justice, Dr. Henrique painted an utterly devastating and compelling portrait. Roberto was not truly the simple, hard-working man they had all known for so many years, but rather a person who led a dangerous double life, seemingly respectable and trustworthy during the day, but secretly capable of brutal, calculated, and cowardly acts when the darkness of night fell upon the city. "Gentlemen of the jury," said the prosecutor in his deep, carefully modulated voice, walking slowly before the jury like a seasoned predator methodically surrounding its defenseless prey. "You will see throughout this trial that the physical and testimonial evidence against the defendant is not only abundant, it is absolutely irrefutable and conclusive." The prosecutor paused theatrically, letting his words echo in the absolute, tense silence of the crowded courtroom. The defendant's fingerprints were clearly marked on the victim's purse. Multiple independent and credible witnesses positively identified him at the crime scene. He has no solid or verifiable alibi for the exact time this dastardly crime was committed. Roberto felt each word like a brutal punch to the gut, each accusation like a precise stab to the heart. The prosecutor continued relentlessly, "This man who sits there in this courtroom desperately trying to appear innocent and harmless, who for years presented himself to this entire community as a model and trustworthy citizen, is in fact a cold, calculating, and completely unscrupulous killer who brutally took the precious life of an innocent young woman, just 28 years old, who had her whole life ahead of her." Oosh! The first witness the prosecutor called for the prosecution was absolutely devastating to any remaining hope the defense might have harbored. Francisca, a 73-year-old woman who had lived near the crime scene for over 40 years, testified with unwavering conviction that she had seen Roberto walking in a visibly nervous and suspicious manner near the vacant lot where the body was found on the very night of the murder. "I recognized him immediately because he'd been to my house about 3 years ago to fix my broken refrigerator," she said with a firm voice and absolute certainty that impressed the entire courtroom. "He was pacing back and forth like a nervous animal, looking around, sweating heavily, looking extremely agitated and guilty." Roberto whispered desperately to his lawyer, "I've never been to that lady's house in my entire life. I've never even seen her before this moment. She's confusing people." But his desperate words against the respectable old woman's seemingly convicted and detailed testimony seemed to carry no weight or credibility before the jury. The second witness was a 24-year-old man named Lucas, who worked the graveyard shift at a gas station near the crime scene. He swore to have seen Roberto buying cigarettes at his establishment in the early hours of the morning, around 2 a.m., just minutes before the forensic experts estimated the murder time. "I remember him perfectly, because I thought it was very strange that someone would show up to buy cigarettes at that time of the morning, and he was visibly very sweaty, nervous, and agitated, as if he had run a lot or made some great physical effort," the young man recounted with details that sounded frighteningly convincing. The devastating problem is that Roberto hadn't smoked in over 10 years, since the day his daughter Anna was born, and he decided to quit to be a better example for his children. His entire family, his closest friends, his regular customers, all could easily attest to this well-known fact. But young Lucas seemed so absolutely certain and detailed in his account that even Roberto began to seriously question his own memory and sanity. When the crucial moment finally arrived to present the scientific fingerprint evidence to the jury, the state's official forensic expert meticulously explained, using impressive technical and scientific terms, how Roberto's fingerprints were found on various spots on the victim's leather bag. "The prints are crystal clear, perfect, and absolutely unequivocal," the expert declared, with a scientific authority that brooked no question. There is absolutely no margin of error. These fingerprints unquestionably belong to the defendant, Roberto Silva. Defense attorney Dr. Fernando courageously attempted to question the validity of the evidence's chain of custody and the technical procedures used in its collection, but his professional inexperience and evident nervousness were painfully apparent to all present. His questions were easily countered and neutralized by the experienced expert, and his hesitant line of questioning failed to raise even the most basic reasonable doubts about the scientific validity of the fingerprints. During his own testimony as defendant, Roberto swore his absolute innocence with sincere tears in his eyes, his voice choked with genuine emotion. He spoke in detail about his simple and honest life, about how he deeply loved his family above all else, about how he had never committed even a minor traffic violation in his entire adult life. But when prosecutor Dr. Henrique began his merciless cross-examination, Roberto found himself completely cornered and with no way out. "If you are truly innocent as you claim," the prosecutor asked with a sarcastic and devastating tone, "how can you logically and convincingly explain your fingerprints on the victim's purse?" Roberto couldn't find any plausible explanation. "How can you explain that 3 independent and reputable witnesses positively identified you at the crime scene?" Again, Roberto had no remotely convincing answer to offer. The prosecutor continued his relentless attack. "Do you really expect this jury of intelligent people to believe wholeheartedly that this is all just one big impossible coincidence? That someone mysterious managed to plant your fingerprints on the victim's purse? That 3 different people who don't even know each other are all lying through their teeth about seeing you at the crime scene?" Roberto could only repeat like a broken record, "I didn't kill anyone. I know it seems completely impossible to believe, but I swear on the lives of my children that I am absolutely innocent of this crime." His words sounded increasingly desperate and unconvincing, and Roberto could clearly see on the faces of the 12 jurors a growing skepticism and a deepening disbelief. The jury retired for deliberation on a Friday afternoon and returned on Monday morning after a whole weekend of discussing the case. When they returned to the courtroom, Roberto desperately tried to read some sign of compassion or doubt in their faces, but he saw only the cold, implacable conviction of people who had made a final decision. The jury foreman rose solemnly and, in a firm voice that echoed throughout the silent courtroom, delivered the verdict that would forever seal Roberto's tragic fate. "We, the members of the jury, find the defendant Roberto Silva guilty of the crime of aggravated murder." A murmur of satisfaction and approval quickly spread through the crowded galleries. Roberto felt his legs weaken violently and had to lean heavily on the table to keep from fainting. He looked desperately behind him and saw Maria in the gallery, weeping silently, with Ana and Pedro beside her, not fully understanding what was happening, but instinctively knowing it was something terrible and final. The judge, an elderly man with over 3 decades of experience in criminal cases, banged his gavel and solemnly declared, "Roberto Silva, you have been found guilty by the jury of the crime of aggravated homicide. Considering the extreme brutality of the crime and your lack of prior criminal history, I sentence you to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole during the first 15 years. 25 years in prison." Roberto made the mathematically simple but emotionally devastating calculations in his completely dazed mind. He would enter prison as a 38-year-old man and leave, if he could survive it all, as a 63-year-old man. His children would be grown adults. Maria would certainly have completely remade her life with another man, and he would be a complete stranger to all the people who once loved and respected Roberto Silva. Now you might be wondering, how can an innocent man be convicted with so much seemingly solid evidence against him? How can witnesses misidentify someone with such conviction? How can fingerprints mysteriously appear where they shouldn't be? Stay with me until the end of this impossible story, because what you'll discover in the next few installments will completely turn your entire understanding of this case upside down. The shocking truth that will be revealed is more surprising and unbelievable than any work of fiction you can imagine. Life in the state penitentiary was a brutal and traumatic shock for Roberto, one that not even his worst nightmares could have prepared him for. That gigantic grey concrete complex, surrounded by towering walls, crowned with multiple rows of electrified barbed wire, seemed to have been architecturally designed with a single, sinister purpose: to completely drain all hope, dignity, and humanity from anyone unlucky enough to enter. The noise was absolutely constant and deafening. Desperate screams echoing through the endless corridors, loud conversations mixed with violent arguments, the incessant metallic slamming of iron doors, heavy footsteps reverberating through the cement staircases like a macabre symphony of human hopelessness. Roberto was assigned to an overcrowded, claustrophobic cell with 5 other men, each carrying their own personal story of pain, anger, regret, and utter despair. The space was so small that they could barely move without bumping into each other, and the constant smell of sweat, fear, and cheap disinfectant created a suffocating atmosphere that tested the limits of any human's physical and mental endurance. There was Carlos, a 35-year-old man convicted of armed robbery, who spent his entire day obsessively doing push-ups while tearfully talking about his 3 young children, whom he hadn't seen in over 3 years, and who, according to his ex-wife's increasingly rare letters, were already beginning to forget what their father looked like. There was also Miguel, an older man of 58, completely gray-haired, convicted of drug trafficking, who read the Bible aloud every night before bed, with the desperate, moving faith of someone trying to find some divine meaning in the tragic mess his life had become. Also sharing the cell was Antonio, a young man of just 22, convicted of robbery, who wept silently in the early hours of the morning, thinking of his elderly mother who depended on his salary and was now completely alone in the world. Then there was Jose, convicted of assault, who remained silent and isolated, staring into space with those dead eyes of someone who had completely given up on any hope of redemption or happiness. The first few months in prison were absolutely the most difficult and traumatic of Roberto's entire life. He had to quickly learn the complex, unwritten rules of prison survival, where it was safe to sit in the chaotic and overcrowded cafeteria, who it was wise to talk to and who it was best to avoid contact with, how to walk the dangerous corridors without showing weakness or fear that could attract predators, how to behave during humiliating searches, how to share the microscopic space of the cell without creating conflicts that could result in violence. Roberto discovered the hard way that in prison, innocence or guilt of a crime mattered far less than the sheer ability to survive each day psychologically and physically without breaking down completely. It was an environment where the law of the jungle prevailed over any civilized concept of justice or humanity. "Look here, newbie," Carlos said one of the first weeks as they lined up for the humiliating collective shower. "You need to understand one fundamental thing. Absolutely everyone here considers themselves innocent. Everyone swears up and down that they were set up by corrupt police. Everyone claims to be a victim of errors in the judicial system. Everyone has a heartbreaking story of injustice to tell." Carlos continued with a bitter smile. "The crucial difference is that some prisoners still believe in this story of innocence and continue to torture themselves, while others have already accepted the cruel reality and learned to move forward in the best way possible within this shit." Roberto obsessively insisted on proclaiming his innocence to anyone who would listen, but he constantly saw, in the weary eyes of his cellmates, guards, staff, and everyone around him, the exact same expression of skeptical and bored disbelief he had seen on the jurors' faces during the trial. It was as if he were shouting his version of events into an endless echo that never returned with any satisfactory answer. During the first 6 months of his incarceration, Roberto categorically refused to participate in any activities offered by the prison. He didn't want to work in the carpentry workshop. He didn't want to attend psychological support groups. He didn't want to participate in sports or educational activities. He spent practically the entire day lying on the narrow, uncomfortable bed, staring at the damp-stained ceiling, mentally counting the days that passed with excruciating slowness, obsessively calculating how many days remained on his sentence. Maria had completely stopped visiting him after officially finalizing the divorce proceedings, a decision Roberto understood rationally, but which devastated him emotionally. His children, Ana and Pedro, now existed only as painful and nostalgic memories that he desperately tried to push from his mind so as not to go completely mad with grief, guilt, and regret for not being able to be there to protect and raise them. It was Miguel, the repentant drug dealer who found refuge in religion, who first made a courageous attempt to pull Roberto out of the deep, destructive depression that was consuming his soul. "Bro, listen to me one Sunday afternoon," Miguel said, carefully closing his worn Bible and sitting on the edge of Roberto's bed. "You can either sit there moping and destroying yourself for the next 25 years of your life, or you can try to do something truly useful and constructive with the time you have left." Miguel continued with a wisdom born of suffering. "The choice is completely yours, brother. But staying there, wasting away like the living dead, won't bring your family back, won't prove your innocence, and certainly won't make the years pass any faster. On the contrary, it will make each day seem like an eternity of torture." The prison library was a surprisingly small and dimly lit space located on the second floor of the administrative building, with old, dark wooden bookshelves and hundreds of books with pages yellowed by age and constant use. Most inmates religiously avoided the library, preferring to spend their free time playing cards, watching the permitted television programs, exercising in the yard, or simply chatting and gossiping in the hallways about life outside. But Roberto gradually discovered in that quiet and relatively peaceful environment an unexpected and life-saving refuge from the progressive madness that constantly threatened to consume his already fragile mind. He began his reading journey with simple fiction and adventure books, thrilling stories that managed to transport his imagination far from those claustrophobic and depressing walls, at least for a few precious hours each day. After a few months, he naturally turned to inspiring biographies of people who had overcome seemingly impossible odds. War survivors, people who had overcome terminal illnesses, individuals who had managed to rebuild their lives after devastating losses. These true stories of human resilience planted in Roberto a microscopic seed of hope that had completely disappeared since his conviction. It was when Roberto stumbled upon a thick, technical book on Brazilian criminal law that his prison life completely changed direction and gained a purpose he hadn't known was still possible. The book's first page specifically discussed documented miscarriages of justice, demonstrably innocent people who had been wrongfully convicted and then exonerated years or even decades later through new evidence, late confessions, technological advances, or case reviews. Roberto felt at that moment as if a tiny but real light had been turned on at the end of an infinitely long and dark tunnel that had become his existence. If other genuinely innocent people had managed to prove their innocence against all odds, even after years in prison, perhaps he too could find a way to clear his name and regain his freedom and dignity. Roberto began studying law with a total and complete obsession that worried his cellmates and even the prison guards. He would wake religiously every day before dawn, when the prison was still relatively quiet and peaceful, and read intensively until his eyes burned with fatigue and his eyelids became too heavy to stay open. He took meticulous and organized notes on scraps of paper he managed to obtain through exchanges with other inmates, memorized entire articles of the federal constitution as if they were poems, memorized complex court procedures, and studied case law on cases similar to his own. His cell gradually transformed into a kind of makeshift legal office, with papers carefully organized and books stacked in every available corner. "Man, you're going crazy," Carlos commented, watching Roberto study intensely until the wee hours of the morning, with the dim light streaming in through the cell's tiny window. "This obsession isn't healthy. You're going to go completely crazy if you keep it up." But Roberto had found something he had long lost. A purpose, a reason to wake up each morning, a concrete hope that perhaps he could change his destiny through knowledge and persistence. He was no longer just passively serving a sentence like a resigned animal. He was actively fighting for his freedom and the truth. After 2 years of intensive, self-taught legal studies, Roberto had acquired an impressive knowledge of criminal, procedural, and constitutional law. He began helping other inmates with their cases, reviewing files, identifying potential procedural errors, and suggesting appeals. His reputation as the inmate's lawyer spread throughout the prison. Miguel watched Roberto's transformation with genuine admiration. "Brother, you have found your mission in life. God works in mysterious ways. Perhaps you came here to discover your true calling." Roberto began obsessively reviewing his own criminal case, analyzing every detail with the trained eye of someone who had studied thousands of pages of law. He identified several potential procedural irregularities during his investigation and trial. Inadequate defense by his inexperienced attorney, possible flaws in the collection of evidence, flaws in the chain of custody, and witnesses who were not adequately questioned. But even with all this acquired legal knowledge, Roberto knew he would need much more than technical irregularities to definitively prove his innocence. He would need to find concrete evidence that he didn't commit the crime, or discover who really killed Carla Regina Santos. Over the years that followed, Roberto developed a theory about his case that kept him awake many nights. Someone had deliberately planted their fingerprints in the victim's bag. Someone had convinced or bribed witnesses to falsely identify him. Someone had meticulously orchestrated his conviction for reasons he still couldn't fathom. But who was this mysterious person, and why would anyone want to destroy the life of a simple, hard-working mechanic who had never harmed anyone? Roberto had no known enemies, owed no money to dangerous individuals, and never engaged in illicit or questionable activities. He was an ordinary man living an absolutely ordinary life. Little by little, Roberto began to develop investigative skills, questioning other inmates about their experiences with the justice system, learning about police corruption, witness bribery, and evidence falsification. He discovered that the world of crime and justice was far more complex and corrupt than his innocent mind had ever imagined. 7 years after his conviction, Roberto had become a respected figure in the prison, not only for his legal knowledge, but also for his integrity, honesty, and the way he treated everyone with dignity and respect, regardless of their crimes. He had become a sort of informal moral leader among the inmates. It was at this time that Roberto decided to take a completely new approach to his case. Instead of simply looking for technical flaws in the case, he began meticulously investigating the life of the victim herself, Carla Regina Santos. Who was she really? Who was she associated with? Were there enemies in her life? Was she involved in any dangerous activities? Roberto spent months writing letters to journalists, lawyers, human rights organizations, anyone who might be interested in reviewing his case. Most didn't respond, but a few letters reached the right recipients and sowed seeds of doubt about his conviction. 10 years after his arrest, Roberto received his first visit from an outsider interested in his case, a young investigative journalist named Laura, who had read about his case in old newspaper archives and was intrigued by some inconsistencies she identified in the original coverage of the crime. "Roberto," Laura said during her first visit, "I've read everything about your case, and some things don't seem right. The evidence is too compelling, too organized. It's as if someone wants you to be guilty." For the first time in a decade, Roberto felt he might not be completely alone in his search for the truth. Laura committed to investigating his case as part of a series of reports on possible miscarriages of justice. 15 years had passed since his conviction. Roberto, now 53, had become a completely different man. His hair was grey, his face lined by his hard life in prison, but his eyes still shone with the determination of someone who had never given up hope of proving his innocence. It was during this period that something extraordinary happened, something none of Roberto's legal training could have predicted or prepared for. In a city hospital, a man was slowly dying of terminal cancer, and this man carried a terrible secret that had tormented his conscience for 15 long years. What do you think will happen next in the story? Could this man in the hospital have any connection to Roberto's case? Comment below with your theory about what's about to be revealed. What comes next will shock you in ways you never imagined possible. Life in the state penitentiary was a brutal and traumatic shock for Roberto, one that not even his darkest nightmares could have prepared him for. That gigantic, intimidating complex of faded grey concrete, surrounded by towering, seemingly insurmountable walls, topped with multiple rows of electrified barbed wire, seemed to have been architecturally designed with a single, sinister and inhumane purpose: to completely drain all hope, dignity, humanity and will to live from anyone unlucky enough to enter it and find themselves transformed into just another number in the prison system. The noise was absolutely constant, deafening and disturbing 24 hours a day. Desperate, agonizing screams echoing through the endless concrete corridors, loud, aggressive conversations mixed with violent arguments that sometimes ended in brawls, the incessant, rhythmic, metallic banging of heavy iron doors, heavy, threatening footsteps reverberating through the damp cement staircases like a macabre symphony of absolute human hopelessness. It was an environment that tested the limits of the psychological and physical endurance of any minimally civilized human being. Roberto was assigned to an overcrowded and utterly claustrophobic cell with 5 other men broken by life, each carrying their own unique story of deep pain, pent-up anger, corrosive regret, and utter despair that seemed endless. The physical space was so microscopically small that they could barely move freely without constantly bumping into each other, creating a constant and suffocating tension. The persistent, nauseating smell of stale sweat, palpable fear, and cheap disinfectant created an unbreathable atmosphere that daily tested the extreme limits of any normal human's physical and mental endurance. The cell environment was like living inside a matchbox with 5 other desperate men, where privacy was a non-existent concept and any moment of peace or quiet was a rare luxury. The peeling grey walls seemed to close in on them each day, and the only tiny, barred window offered a depressing view of another concrete wall, a constant reminder that the outside world was but a distant memory. There was Carlos, a 35-year-old man with arms covered in tattoos that told the story of his life on the streets, convicted of armed robbery after a series of desperate decisions he made when he lost his job and couldn't feed his family. He literally spent all day doing obsessive, endless push-ups while talking with genuine tears in his eyes about his 3 young children, Sofia, 8, Miguel, 6, and little Ana, just 4, whom he hadn't seen in over 3 long, torturous years. According to the increasingly rare and distant letters from his ex-wife, who had moved to another city to start a new life, the children were already gradually beginning to forget what their father looked like, a reality that shattered Carlos every night. There was also Miguel, an older, wiser man of 58, with completely graying hair and deep wrinkles, marring a face that had seen too much of life, convicted of drug trafficking in a police operation that caught him transporting narcotics to support his family after being unemployed for 2 years. Miguel read the Holy Bible aloud and slowly every night, before everyone went to sleep, with the desperate, moving and unshakable faith of someone who was genuinely trying to find some divine meaning and higher purpose in the tragic and seemingly meaningless mess his life had become after decades of honest work. Also sharing the cell was Antonio, a young man of just 22, convicted of robbery, who wept silently in the early hours of the morning, thinking of his elderly mother who depended on his salary and was now completely alone in the world. Then there was Jose, convicted of assault, who remained silent and isolated, staring into space with those dead eyes of someone who had completely given up on any hope of redemption or happiness. The first few months in prison were absolutely the most difficult and traumatic of Roberto's entire life. He had to quickly learn the complex, unwritten rules of prison survival, where it was safe to sit in the chaotic and overcrowded cafeteria, who it was wise to talk to and who it was best to avoid contact with, how to walk the dangerous corridors without showing weakness or fear that could attract predators, how to behave during humiliating searches, how to share the microscopic space of the cell without creating conflicts that could result in violence. Roberto discovered the hard way that in prison, innocence or guilt of a crime mattered far less than the sheer ability to survive each day psychologically and physically without breaking down completely. It was an environment where the law of the jungle prevailed over any civilized concept of justice or humanity. "Look here, newbie," Carlos said one of the first weeks as they lined up for the humiliating collective shower. "You need to understand one fundamental thing. Absolutely everyone here considers themselves innocent. Everyone swears up and down that they were set up by corrupt police. Everyone claims to be a victim of errors in the judicial system. Everyone has a heartbreaking story of injustice to tell." Carlos continued with a bitter smile. The crucial difference is that some prisoners still believe in this story of innocence and continue to torture themselves, while others have already accepted the cruel reality and learned to move forward in the best way possible within this shit. Roberto obsessively insisted on proclaiming his innocence to anyone who would listen, but he constantly saw, in the weary eyes of his cellmates, guards, staff, and everyone around him, the exact same expression of skeptical and bored disbelief he had seen on the jurors' faces during the trial. It was as if he were shouting his version of events into an endless echo that never returned with any satisfactory answer. During the first 6 devastating and traumatic months of his incarceration, Roberto steadfastly and stubbornly refused to participate in any activities offered by the prison administration. He refused to hear about working in the noisy carpentry workshop where inmates made simple furniture for paltry wages. He refused to attend the psychological support groups led by well-meaning but naive volunteers. He refused to participate in sports activities in the courtyard, where violence could erupt at any moment for any trivial reason. Roberto would lie nearly all day in his narrow, uncomfortable, bed-bug-infested bed, staring at the damp, mold-stained ceiling, mentally and obsessively counting the days that passed with an utterly torturous and inhuman slowness. He would compulsively calculate how many days, weeks, months, and years remained of his seemingly infinite sentence, an obsession that consumed him and drove him further from his sanity. He had created a precise mental calendar, marking each passing day as a small victory against time, but also as a cruel reminder of how much time remained until a freedom that might never come. 25 years seemed like an absolute eternity to a man who knew with absolute certainty that he was completely innocent of the crime for which he was paying. Maria had completely stopped visiting him after officially finalizing the divorce proceedings, a decision Roberto understood rationally, but which devastated him emotionally. His children, Ana and Pedro, now existed only as painful and nostalgic memories that he desperately tried to push from his mind so as not to go completely mad with grief, guilt, and regret for not being able to be there to protect and raise them. It was Miguel, the repentant drug dealer who found refuge in religion, who first made a courageous attempt to pull Roberto out of the deep destructive depression that was consuming his soul. "Bro, listen to me one Sunday afternoon," Miguel said, carefully closing his worn Bible and sitting on the edge of Roberto's bed. "You can either sit there moping and destroying yourself for the next 25 years of your life, or you can try to do something truly useful and constructive with the time you have left." Miguel continued with a wisdom born of suffering. "The choice is completely yours, brother, but staying there, wasting away like the living dead, won't bring your family back, won't prove your innocence, and certainly won't make the years pass any faster. On the contrary, it will make each day seem like an eternity of torture." Indeed, the prison library was a surprisingly small and chronically poorly lit space, strategically located on the second floor of the administrative building, away from the constant noise of the cells. Its old, dark, worm-eaten wood shelves housed hundreds of books with pages yellowed by age, humidity, and the constant use of decades of inmates seeking some kind of mental escape. The space had a distinctive smell of old paper, mold, and disinfectant that, strangely, Roberto came to associate with peace and hope. The overwhelming majority of prisoners religiously avoided that silent place, considering it a place for weaklings and intellectuals, preferring to spend their precious free time playing cards, smoking cigarettes, watching the few television programs allowed by the prison administration, doing intense exercises in the yard to maintain the physical shape necessary to survive, or simply talking and gossiping incessantly in the corridors about life outside, about women, about impossible escape plans, about the injustice of the system. But Roberto gradually and surprisingly discovered in that silent, organized, and relatively peaceful environment an unexpected and truly saving refuge from the progressive and relentless madness that constantly threatened to consume his mind, already weakened by the traumas of his unjust incarceration. It was the only place in prison where he could breathe deeply without feeling the oppressive weight of claustrophobia and despair. He began his reading journey with simple fiction and adventure books, thrilling stories that managed to transport his imagination far from those claustrophobic and depressing walls, at least for a few precious hours each day. After a few months, he naturally turned to inspiring biographies of people who had overcome seemingly impossible odds. War survivors, people who had overcome terminal illnesses, individuals who had managed to rebuild their lives after devastating losses. These true stories of human resilience planted in Roberto a microscopic seed of hope that had completely disappeared since his conviction. It was when Roberto stumbled upon a thick technical book on Brazilian criminal law that his prison life completely changed direction and gained a purpose he hadn't known was still possible. The book's first page specifically discussed documented miscarriages of justice, demonstrably innocent people who had been wrongfully convicted and then exonerated years or even decades later through new evidence, late confessions, technological advances, or case reviews. Roberto felt at that moment as if a tiny but real light had been turned on at the end of an infinitely long and dark tunnel that had become his existence. If other genuinely innocent people had managed to prove their innocence against all odds, even after years in prison, perhaps he too could find a way to clear his name and regain his freedom and dignity. Roberto began studying criminal law, criminal procedure, and constitutional law with a total, complete, and almost unhealthy obsession that genuinely worried not only his cellmates, but also the most experienced prison guards who had never seen an inmate so dedicated to his studies. He would wake religiously every day before dawn, when the prison was still enveloped in relative stillness and the first rays of sunlight were beginning to filter through the barred windows, creating an almost serene atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the chaos that would ensue as soon as everyone awoke. Roberto read intensively and voraciously, until his eyes burned with extreme fatigue and his eyelids grew too heavy to stay open, often reading until 2 or 3 in the morning by the dim light of the cell lamp, or even using the light that filtered through the tiny window during a full moon. His thirst for legal knowledge was insatiable, desperate, as if each page he read brought him a millimeter closer to the freedom he longed for. He took meticulous and organized notes on scraps of paper he managed to obtain through exchanges with other inmates, memorized entire articles of the federal Constitution as if they were poems, memorized complex court procedures, and studied case law on cases similar to his own. His cell gradually transformed into a kind of makeshift legal office, with papers carefully organized and books stacked in every available corner. "Man, you're going crazy," Carlos commented, watching Roberto study intensely until the wee hours of the morning with the dim light streaming in through the cell's tiny window. "This obsession isn't healthy. You're going to go completely crazy if you keep it up." But Roberto had found something he had long lost, a purpose, a reason to wake up each morning, a concrete hope that perhaps he could change his destiny through knowledge and persistence. He was no longer just passively serving a sentence like a resigned animal. He was actively fighting for his freedom and the truth. After 2 years of intensive self-taught legal studies, Roberto had acquired an impressive knowledge of criminal, procedural, and constitutional law. He began helping other inmates with their cases, reviewing files, identifying potential procedural errors, and suggesting appeals. His reputation as the inmate's lawyer spread throughout the prison. Miguel watched Roberto's transformation with genuine admiration. "Brother, you have found your mission in life. God works in mysterious ways. Perhaps you came here to discover your true calling." Roberto began obsessively reviewing his own criminal case, analyzing every detail with the trained eye of someone who had studied thousands of pages of law. He identified several potential procedural irregularities during his investigation and trial: inadequate defense by his inexperienced attorney, possible flaws in the collection of evidence, flaws in the chain of custody, and witnesses who were not adequately questioned. But even with all this acquired legal knowledge, Roberto knew he would need much more than technical irregularities to definitively prove his innocence. He would need to find concrete evidence that he didn't commit the crime, or discover who really killed Carla Regina Santos. Over the years that followed, Roberto developed a theory about his case that kept him awake many nights. Someone had deliberately planted their fingerprints in the victim's bag. Someone had convinced or bribed witnesses to falsely identify him. Someone had meticulously orchestrated his conviction for reasons he still couldn't fathom. But who was this mysterious person, and why would anyone want to destroy the life of a simple, hard-working mechanic who had never harmed anyone? Roberto had no known enemies, owed no money to dangerous individuals, and never engaged in illicit or questionable activities. He was an ordinary man, living an absolutely ordinary life. Little by little, Roberto began to develop investigative skills, questioning other inmates about their experiences with the justice system, learning about police corruption, witness bribery, and evidence falsification. He discovered that the world of crime and justice was far more complex and corrupt than his innocent mind had ever imagined. 7 years after his conviction, Roberto had become a respected figure in the prison, not only for his legal knowledge, but also for his integrity, honesty, and the way he treated everyone with dignity and respect, regardless of their crimes. He had become a sort of informal moral leader among the inmates. It was at this time that Roberto decided to take a completely new approach to his case. Instead of simply looking for technical flaws in the case, he began meticulously investigating the life of the victim herself, Carla Regina Santos. Who was she really? Who was she associated with? Were there enemies in her life? Was she involved in any dangerous activities? Roberto spent months writing letters to journalists, lawyers, human rights organizations, anyone who might be interested in reviewing his case. Most didn't respond, but a few letters reached the right recipients and sowed seeds of doubt about his conviction. 10 years after his arrest, Roberto received his first visit from an outsider interested in his case, a young investigative journalist named Laura, who had read about his case in old newspaper archives and was intrigued by some inconsistencies she identified in the original coverage of the crime. "Roberto," Laura said during her first visit, "I've read everything about your case, and some things don't seem right. The evidence is too compelling, too organized. It's as if someone wants you to be guilty." For the first time in a decade, Roberto felt he might not be completely alone in his search for the truth. Laura committed to investigating his case as part of a series of reports on possible miscarriages of justice. 15 years had passed since his wrongful conviction, 15 years of a life that should never have been stolen from him. Roberto, now 53, well-lived but prematurely aged by the harshness of prison life, had become a man physically and psychologically completely different from the simple, innocent mechanic who was arrested that Tuesday morning that changed everything forever. His hair was not just grey, but almost completely white, his face deeply etched with the expression lines earned through a difficult, unfair and inhumane prison life. But his eyes, oh, his eyes, still shone brightly with the iron, unwavering determination of someone who had literally never given up hope of proving his innocence and clearing his name before the world. His hands, once the calloused hands of an honest mechanic, were now those of a self-taught scholar, marked by thousands of hours holding books, taking notes, writing appeals and petitions. His body had adapted to prison life. He was thinner, more alert, more cautious, but his soul retained the same purity of someone who knew that truth, no matter how long it took, would one day triumph over lies and injustice. It was during this 15th year of incarceration that something utterly extraordinary and unexpected happened, something that none of the thousands of law books Roberto had devoured, none of the legal strategies he had meticulously planned, none of the resources he had carefully prepared could have predicted, anticipated, or prepared for. The truth, which had remained buried for a decade and a half, like a rotten, toxic secret, was finally about to come to light in the most unexpected way possible. In a city hospital, a man was slowly dying of terminal cancer, and this man carried a terrible secret that had tormented his conscience for 15 long years. What do you think will happen next in the story? Could this man in the hospital have any connection to Roberto's case? Comment below with your theory about what's about to be revealed. What comes next will shock you in ways you never imagined possible. In a hospital across town, a man was slowly dying. Eduardo Mendez, 64, a retired police officer, had been hospitalized for 3 weeks with terminal cancer. The doctors had been clear. He had only a few days left to live. But Eduardo carried a weight on his conscience that was becoming unbearable with each labored breath he took. For 15 years, Eduardo had lived with a terrible secret that ate away at his soul like acid. Every night, when he closed his eyes, he saw the face of Roberto Silva, the mechanic he knew was completely innocent of the crime for which he was serving a 25-year prison sentence. Eduardo had been the police officer responsible for the initial investigation into Carla Regina Santos's murder, but what no one knew was that Eduardo was being blackmailed by Marcos Vieira, a dangerous criminal who had actually committed the crime. Marcos had discovered that Eduardo was receiving bribes from local drug traffickers and threatened to expose the corruption unless Eduardo found a scapegoat for the murder. "Find someone to blame, or I'll ruin your career and your family," Marcos had said in a conversation Eduardo would never forget. "There's that mechanic over there, Roberto. Everyone likes him, no one will suspect. He's perfect." Eduardo, desperate and terrified by the threats against his family, had done the unthinkable. He planted Roberto's fingerprints on the victim's bag using a cup Roberto had used at a community party weeks earlier. They bribed witnesses with money and threats. They fabricated evidence to ensure the conviction of an innocent man. Now, with death approaching, Eduardo could no longer bear the burden. He called his daughter Patricia, a nurse at the hospital, and asked her to bring a tape recorder. "Daughter, I need to confess something terrible I did. I can't die taking this with me," Eduardo said, his voice weak but determined. "An innocent man is in prison because of me, and I need to tell the truth." With tears in his eyes, Eduardo recorded a full 2-hour confession, detailing in minute detail how he had fabricated the evidence against Roberto, who had actually committed the crime, and how the entire investigation was a sham orchestrated by corruption and blackmail. Roberto Silva never touched that woman. He was never at the crime scene. "I destroyed a good man's life to protect my own dirty skin," Eduardo confessed, coughing up blood between words. "Marcos Vieira is the real killer. He killed Carla because she discovered he was selling drugs to minors and threatened to report him." Eduardo died 3 days after making his confession. Patricia, devastated but determined to seek justice, immediately handed the recording to journalist Laura, who had become a tireless defender of Roberto's innocence. The news exploded like a bomb in the city. Eduardo's confession was widely publicized, and public pressure to free Roberto became impossible to ignore. Prosecutor Dr. Enrique, who had built his career on Roberto's conviction, initially tried to question the validity of the confession, but the evidence was irrefutable. Roberto learned of the confession from Laura, who rushed to the prison as soon as she received the recording. When she told him about Eduardo's confession, Roberto felt a mixture of overwhelming relief and profound anger. 15 years of my life were stolen because of this man's cowardice," Roberto said, tears streaming freely down his face. "My children grew up without a father. My wife rebuilt her life, and I lost everything because of a lie." But Roberto, strengthened by years of legal study, knew exactly what he needed to do. Using the knowledge he had acquired in prison, he himself drafted a petition for criminal review, citing Eduardo's confession and demanding his immediate release. The process was swift. Faced with such overwhelming evidence, the court had no choice but to acknowledge the miscarriage of justice. 3 months after Eduardo's confession, Roberto Silva was officially acquitted of all charges. The prison break was surreal. Reporters, cameras, and flashes were everywhere. Roberto, now 53, stepped outside the bars for the first time in 15 years as a free and innocent man. Justice took a while, but it arrived, were his first words to the press. "Now I will fight to ensure this never happens to another innocent person again." Roberto wasted no time lamenting the lost years. With the determination he had developed in prison, he immediately sued the state for miscarriage of justice, wrongful imprisonment, and incalculable moral damages. The case was led by Roberto himself, a self-taught lawyer more competent than many trained professionals. He presented a meticulous case, documenting every day of unjust suffering, every lost opportunity, every psychological damage caused by the wrongful conviction. "Your honorable judges," Roberto said during his oral argument, "I'm not here just for the money. I'm here for the dignity of every citizen who trusts the justice system. What happened to me could happen to any of you, to your children, to your families." The victory was overwhelming. The court ordered the state to pay Roberto 15 million reais in compensation, 1 million for each year of his unjust imprisonment. But more important than the money was the official recognition of his innocence and the error of the system. Roberto used part of his compensation to open a law firm specializing in defending the wrongfully accused. Second Chance Law was the name he gave his firm, which quickly became a benchmark in the fight against miscarriages of justice. At 55, Roberto had found his true calling. His prison experiences, combined with his self-taught studies, made him a unique lawyer, one who truly understood the suffering of those wrongly accused. He tried to reconnect with his children, Ana and Pedro, now adults. The process was difficult and painful. They had grown up believing their father was a murderer, and accepting the truth took time. But gradually, Roberto managed to rebuild a relationship with them, explaining his innocence and showing the integrity he had always been. Maria, his ex-wife, had remarried and built a new life. Roberto respected her and didn't try to interfere, understanding that time could not be reversed and that she had made the best decisions possible given the dire circumstances they faced. Roberto became a respected public figure, giving lectures on miscarriages of justice, writing articles on prison reform, and fighting tirelessly to improve prisoner conditions and the quality of justice. In one of his most famous speeches, Roberto said, "Prison took 15 years of my life, but it gave me something I would never have discovered otherwise, my true purpose. Today I know that I went through this so I could help other innocent people not go through the same hell." His story inspired changes in legislation, stricter laws for criminal investigations, better training for public defenders, and more careful procedures for collecting and analyzing evidence were passed. Roberto never remarried, dedicating his life entirely to law and the fight for justice. By the age of 60, he had already helped exonerate more than 30 wrongfully convicted people, saving hundreds of years of unjust imprisonment. His auto repair shop was transformed into a free legal aid center for low-income families. The place where it all began had become a symbol of hope and justice. This is the incredible story of Roberto Silva, a simple man whose life was destroyed by a miscarriage of justice, but who transformed this tragedy into the greatest victory possible, the victory of truth over lies, of justice over corruption, of hope over despair. Roberto proved that even in the most desperate circumstances, when all seems lost, it is still possible to fight, resist, and win. His story teaches us that the truth, no matter how long it takes, always finds a way to come to light. What did you think of this stunning twist? A story that began with the destruction of an innocent man and ended with his transformation into a defender of other innocents. Roberto not only regained his freedom, he found his true destiny. If you enjoyed this true story of resilience and justice, leave a comment telling us what impressed you most. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more incredible stories like this, and be sure to watch the next recommended video. We have more